Hello, I'm Majo Gasal, and today I'm going to discuss the Tlatelolco Massacre and the amnesty laws in Mexico. To begin with, I will start by explaining the context in which the massacre takes place. In 1968, Mexico was the scene of numerous protests led by students who were fighting against the repression of freedom and democracy in universities. The government, led by Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, severely limited the right for free expression and prohibited protests not only by students but also by workers, electricians, telephone workers, etc. To contain these demonstrations, it resorted to the use of the army as an instrument of control. At the time, the country was under the rule of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, and there were no autonomous institutions such as the National Electoral Institute, INE. This allowed the same party to perpetuate itself in power, as elections were organized and manipulated by an authoritarian government that did not allow for true democratic competition. The conflict began months earlier, towards the end of July, when a soccer match between students from the National Polytechnic Institute, IPN, and the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, escalated into a fight. The situation intensified when the police intervened to break up the altercation, repressing both teams, and leaving several people seriously injured. This provoked outrage in the students' community, which led the IPN to issue a report and initiate peaceful demonstrations against the government. In the context of these protests, students' leaders from UNAM and the Polytechnic met during a protest that addressed issues related to socialism in Cuba. From this meeting came out the idea of creating the Consejo Nacional de Huelga, an organization that sought to coordinate the protests and demand justice for the recent events. Eventually, private schools also joined these peaceful strikes. However, the authorities responded systematically by sending first the grenadiers and later the army to repress any mobilization they considered out of control. Society supported the student movement and the protests because the demands represented a collective yearning for justice and democracy. Among their main objectives were to guarantee university autonomy, dissolve the Grenadier Corps, free the political prisoners in Lecumberri, and strengthen democratic principles. These goals were presented in a list of demands and were defeated through peaceful demonstrations. One of the most emblematic protests was the March of Silence, where the participants, including students, professors, and even the president of the UNAM, Javier Barros Sierra, marched with adhesive tape covering their mouths as a symbol of censorship. Only the applause of spectators and the footsteps of those marching could be heard. Even some members of the government sympathized with the cause. During this demonstration, around 3,000 students camped in the streets, but the army invaded the Zócalo with tanks, violently repressing and dispersing the demonstrators. Days earlier, a protest by UNAM students at the Monument to the Revolution was brutally repressed. The army, in command of the operation, surrounded the protesters and acted with extreme violence. It was rumored that the soldiers were drugged with marijuana to carry out these actions. During these protests, a student leader was assassinated, which caused panic and a stampede, in which students sought refuge in nearby homes or businesses. Although the citizens tried to help and protect them, the army pursued them, interrogating, capturing, and in many cases subjecting them to torture, imprisonment, or forced disappearances. October 2, 1968 marked the most tragic episode of the student movement in Mexico. On that day, the protest at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco sought to reach a truce with the government as the Olympics were about to be held in Mexico, and the students hoped to reach an agreement based on their list of demands. Not only students participated, but also women, children, workers, and other sectors of society who had joined the movement in an act of solidarity. At the end of the demonstration, under the orders of Gustavo Díaz Ordaz and with Luis Echeverría as Secretary of the Interior, the signal was given to begin the repression. 2 flares were launched, although it is still unknown whether they came from a helicopter or from the Chihuahua building, where members of the government were present. This act marked the beginning of a massacre. The government tried to justify the events by claiming that the students were armed and had started shooting first. However, snipers and soldiers from the Olympia Battalion, identified with a white glove, were already infiltrated among the demonstrators. These agents, together with members of the Presidential General Staff and the Federal Security Directorate, carried out a violent operation that included massive arrests. Student leaders were captured, some stripped naked, tortured, and killed. After the massacre, with an incalculable number of dead, missing, and wounded, the government mobilized firefighters and soldiers to clean up the square and hide all evidence. The bodies were piled into trucks and quickly removed, as it was crucial for the regime to maintain an image of stability in view of the imminent celebration of the Olympic Games. This act of brutality was recorded as one of the darkest chapters in Mexico's contemporary history. This event meant a great unification among universities and students who were in solidarity with the cause. However, the authorities manipulated the narrative of what happened. The government-controlled media propagated an official version that blamed the students for initiating the shooting and minimized the magnitude of the tragedy, claiming that there were only 50 dead, when in reality the number was much higher and could never be accurately determined. Due to the imposed censorship, the media could not report the truth for fear of losing their concessions. In response, the students appealed to the solidarity of the people, requesting economic support to print flyers to distribute the facts and deny the official version. The Tlatelolco massacre had an international impact, becoming an issue of worldwide relevance. Student demonstrations in several countries took place in support of democracy and the Mexican movement, reflecting the global scale of the struggle for justice and human rights. During the Dirty War in Mexico, the PRI regime used violent repression against opposition groups, including massacres, forced disappearances, and the suppression of freedom of expression. In the face of growing resistance, guerrillas emerged, and the government responded with more violence. In this context, in 1978, President José López Portillo enacted the Amnesty law, which sought to put an end to the violence without punishing those responsible, mainly government authorities who had violated human rights. This law consolidated impunity and generated distrust in institutions, which led to an ongoing struggle by victims and their families to obtain justice. In 2001, the government of Vicente Fox attempted to investigate these violations through the Truth Commission, but faced problems such as the lack of complete archives and the resistance of the authorities involved, which prevented an accurate clarification of the number of victims. To commemorate these events, monuments were erected and the October 2nd Memorial Museum was created to preserve the historical memory of the violations committed during this period. There are several movies, documentaries, and interviews with testimonies of people and leaders who experienced firsthand the repression, torture, and even imprisonment in Lecumberri, the most infamous prison in Mexico at that time. I chose to talk about this case because my father was one of those students who experienced oppression, fear, and frustration for fighting for their rights, for democracy and freedom. He witnessed the death of his friends simply for wanting to defend their rights, and today Mexico continues to face serious corruption problems and situations like those of that time that seem to be reappearing. During AMLO's presidency, Mexico faced one of its most violent periods in recent history, with concealed death tolls and repression of those advocating for democracy. Media censorship persists, there are ongoing efforts to militarize the country, and a judicial reform is weakening key institutions. These challenges are the result of decisions made by those in power, the electorate's choices, and the lack of accountability for those responsible. In my opinion, transitional justice is the basis for addressing conflicts within the international system that have violated human rights and caused significant harm to society. It is fundamental to international relations, as it is a process by which states can achieve harmony within their territories and ensure the protection of individuals. It is essential to carry out a process of reparation and reconstruction, both for the victims and for the nation, in order to heal collective wounds and promote a historical memory that commemorates the events and prevents their repetition in the future. In addition, it is crucial to impose the necessary sanctions on those responsible to achieve balance between justice and peace, restoring morale within society. Thank you.